Hey everyone, welcome to Madden Science. Today we're doing our first APES, AP Environmental Science, flipped classroom lesson. Now you note that this is happening in Unit 1, which is dealing with the living world, specifically ecosystems, and then really we're starting at the beginning of BioGeoChemical Cycles. So we're happening right in here. So carbon to nitrogen, phosphorus, and water, hydrologic cycle. Now, specifically, we're kind of cramming in at that beginning part. So if we look ahead here at Concept 3, BioGeoChemical Cycles, we're in this section, and then in particular starting with Chapter 2.1, which deals with matter, chemistry, and the environment. A little bit of background. So for our flipped classroom and flipped lesson ideas, make sure that you're taking notes, probably some drawings, writing down some questions that you might have. Definitely follow along with your book. That'll probably be helpful. Remember, you can pause this video, go back, rewind. Additionally, part of the assignment is that you need to include at least one comment in the comment sections. So if you look in here, it can be a link, a resource, a website, or news, something interesting that adds to the conversation. So this will be good for this year with our class and our students, and also for years to come. Feel free to comment on someone else's comment, and be sure to tag the time in the video. So start out your comment and include the time in the video that you're referencing. So again, we're in 2.1, matter, chemistry, and the environment. An example of something you could have used, the news that we brought in the other day relating to the Amazon fires, this one from Wired. Maybe you talk about the edge effect, or maybe you talk about the differences with carbon source and sink, or the way in which this degraded ecosystem due to deforestation is less able to function as a carbon sink and to function as carbon sequestration. Maybe you want to add a link in when we're talking about nitrogen cycle and nitrogen fixation. Here's a real cool resource from Radiolab, From Tree to Shining Tree. Check it out. More information in the description. So the case study that begins this chapter is dealing with the earthquake in Japan, 2011. Massive earthquake led to the problems with the Fukushima power plant. So we want to take a look at what it means for that power plant, what it means for the ecosystem. Keeping in mind two key concepts here: the energy flows and matter cycles. So in this diagram, you can see the chemistry portion in blue cycling around. That's the matter. That's the material of the world. Whereas energy is flowing and it's all zigzaggy, and part of that is because much of that energy is lost, particularly as you go from one level to the next. That'll be the end of the chapter. So if we back up a little bit, in here when we get into primary productivity, trophic levels, and particularly 10% rule, we'll see that as energy cycles, as it's doing in red in this diagram, much of that energy is lost as heat. A cool app to look at might be the elements, and here you see it in 3D, this guy moving. Particularly, we'll be looking at carbon. Note that you can spin it around like that, which is really satisfying. We'll have the water cycle, so H2O, so hydrogen and oxygen. We'll be dealing with nitrogen cycle. Again, this guy can be moved. We can also click forward and spin other parts around, stop them, spin backwards. Doesn't really have anything to do with class, but it's kind of fun. And lastly, we'll be dealing with phosphorus cycle. Here's some phosphorus. Cool. As we jump back into our slideshow, we can see the dawn, or the origin of the universe, and the production of the elements. The book talks about Fukushima, defining matter as any material that has mass and takes up space, where chemistry is the study of those interactions, really the study of how electrons interact, or the relationships between matter. The beginning of the book also talks about law of conservation of matter. You may remember from physics, conservation of energy. This is related. So matter and ecosystem constantly cycles. So the overall amount remains the same, but where it is, whether it's in a source or a sink or the reservoir, if it's in flux, that may change both seasonally, year to year, or from one location to the next. Here's an interesting diagram of relative abundances of elements in the universe. You can see, again, this is an order of magnitudes on the side, that hydrogen and helium are by far the greatest. Maybe check out They Might Be Giants Meet the Elements. Pretty funny and cool song. Speaking of music, remember that Taylor Swift in her video had on a cool periodic table shirt. This gives you like a 3D map comparing relative abundance on Earth and relative abundance in the human body. And you note that it's not exactly the same, but it's pretty close. Keeping in mind that, in fact, you are what you eat, right? You're made of the dust of the stars, you're made of the Earth. On to the chemistry pieces. You can see carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen, really 3 of the 4 elements of life, hydrogen being the 4th, shown here, and they have particular traits. What determines an element is how many protons it has. So on the periodic table, these guys are arranged in order 1 through 92 naturally, now up to, over 103 on this, and then 118 over on the side here. So those elements are ordered based on how many protons. Now the atom's characteristics and behavior are also determined by neutrons and electrons. So protons are positively charged, often you write it as a P+. Neutrons are neutral, often write N with a 0 or not, and electrons are negatively charged. You can see that the nucleus is made up of a combination of protons and neutrons, and circling around there, a cloud, not quite like this Bohr model, but circling around there would be the electrons. And so it's the electrons that, in fact, come in contact or interact with another element. Here you can see the numbers as they vary. Now we'll move into what happens as these change. So if a proton changes, you can't really just move them in and out, but as protons move up, you get a different element. So moving from 6 to 7 takes you from carbon to nitrogen. Add another one, you get oxygen. Now you can change electrons and neutrons and not change the actual element. You may change the properties of it. So if you look just at carbon, you have C as a symbol, 6 is the atomic number. If you add up neutrons and protons, you get the mass number. Atomic number also is the number of electrons when the atom is neutral. Here's another look at just, in particular, hydrogen and its isotopes. Notice that each hydrogen has 1 proton. Note what's changing, however, is the number of neutrons or perhaps the number of electrons. If you change the number of neutrons, you get an isotope. So that's changed neutrons. If you change the number of electrons, you get an ion, either positive or negative. Back to Fukushima. Some atoms, when released in the case of this nuclear disaster, are radioactive or radioisotopes. So they continue to test this water. Some of that fallout could be detected from around the globe. Here's another look at just 3 different atoms, hydrogen, carbon, and gold. Their number of protons and electrons. Notice that they're all balanced, so these atoms are neutral. Just a quick look at table of isotopes and their masses and natural abundances. A few that we'll use most common would be in here with carbon. And so most carbons are carbon-12, which means that it's 6 protons and 6 neutrons. Now in the case of carbon-13, you would have 7 neutrons. In the case of carbon-14, there's 8 neutrons. And note that the percentages in nature get lower and lower. Most carbon in the world has 6 neutrons. The ones that are not basic, some of them are radioactive or radioisotopes. Here's a view at just that figure. Note that the nucleus in the atom gets a little bit bigger as you go from 12, 13 to 14, and you add a neutron each time. If you change the number of electrons, you have an ion. In this case, if you were to put together NaCl or sodium chloride, they work together through an ionic bond, in this case where a neutral sodium atom and a neutral chlorine atom come together. This electron is lost, ends up being gained into an outer shell from chlorine here at the bottom. So if you look at the after picture, this redox reaction, lose an electron and gain electron, you have a +1 sodium and a -1 chlorine ion, or a chloride, and they attract each other positive to negative. It's important to note that the relative sizes of these atoms change as you get a little bit smaller when you become a cation or positive ion, and you get a little bit bigger when you gain an electron. One of the things you may recall from chemistry is things like ionization energy, or even before that, effective nuclear charge. That's one thing to maybe review to see what properties govern the chemistry and the interaction of different elements. So effective nuclear charge. Look that guy back up. Just another view of the change in ion size. The book mentions uranium and its ability to power reactors. So elements have different properties as they break down. Here's a view back at the relative abundances of the key elements in the Earth's crust. Can you notice kind of in these top elements here for the crust and the ocean and air, all pretty similar. And then here's relative abundance in you and life on Earth. Again, here's another look at life on Earth. And we mentioned before elements of life: oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. Here they are by percent mass in your body. You can pause it right here. We're not going to go into detail, but really cool abundance of elements: universe, ocean, atmosphere, Earth, Earth's crust, and you, humans. Or a comparison here. This gets us into a little bit of half-life. So in red, you got the presence of radioisotopes. You got cesium, and you also have carbon-14. So major output of these radioisotopes with the dawn of nuclear testing. Some of that still is happening. You can see a big blip in the case of Chernobyl, and a big blip in the case of Fukushima just 8 years ago. Here are the two most common isotopes of uranium, 238 and 235. If you take a peek just at uranium down here at 92, looks like this, pretty beautiful. And some of its other uses, you could read about it here or spin these guys around. If we look back, you can see breakdown of plutonium on the left, and then some of the natural occurrences of those isotopes in the case of uranium. So very little of it is 235, most of it is 238, and again, that number refers to really the amount of neutrons present in a uranium atom, because uranium is always going to have 92 protons no matter what. So here it is with 146 neutrons versus 143. You can see what's happening. You hear these words every now and again in the news with low enriched uranium or highly enriched uranium. Another cool app you might want to check is Elements in Action, similar to this guy, except it has some videos for interactions. Just a view of some breakdown from a parent isotope to daughter isotopes, or the before and after. Another look at carbon and its 3 common isotopes. Mention about some of the nuclear fallout. Here we see from nuclear testing some crazy increase in carbon-14 in the atmosphere. So normally used for testing, because it has a steady level in the atmosphere. Well, up and around 1965, you can see that level almost doubled. And it's just now continuing a trend downwards, almost back to its normal level of 100%. Quick look, lots of different elements can be used as radioisotopes, and they have plenty of uses in medicine. So here you can kind of peek in some of them from radiotherapy, thyroid therapy, detecting skin cancer, you name it. There's a visual that shows half-lives. So on the bottom, number of half-lives. On the y-axis, the amount of the original or parent isotope that's left. This brings us to a little bit of APES math. So problem number 1. It says, archaeologists find an artifact and it's shown to have 10 milligrams of carbon-14 compared to a present-day specimen that is 80 milligrams of carbon-14. Carbon-14's half-life is 5,730 years. How old is that artifact? Well, we can compare and realize that 10 milligrams compared to 80 milligrams, right, is 1/8, and that would be how many half-lives? Well, you start with 1, and then you become 1/2, and then a half, and then a half, so that's first half-life, second, and third. You end up with 1/8. So it means that carbon went through 3 half-lives, which means that you're going to have, we'll write it this way. 3 half-lives and for carbon, it has 1 half-life is 5,730 years. If we multiply those two together, so if we clear that out and we do 5730 times 3, we get 17,190 years. So 17,190 years. That's how old that artifact is. Okay, this next one is for you to do in your notes. It says an isotope has a half-life of 50 years. If it starts out at 100 grams, how much will be left after 250 years? Another part of the book talks about ionizing radiation, so radiation energy emitted by radioisotopes. It generates ions when it hits molecules, and this can be damaging. So here's some non-ionizing and ionizing radiation. It shows the frequencies on there, and it also shows wavelengths. A little more on the chemistry. You may remember these terms from earlier in your science career. Molecules being combinations of 2 or more atoms chemically bonded, so like oxygen, or a compound, which would be 2 or more different elements, such as water or carbon dioxide. If we look into the bonding, probably our most important set of bonds that you learned about already would be those interacting within water. Covalent, so covalent, means it's sharing the valence electrons. So it's a shared relationship as opposed to giving up like we saw earlier with sodium and chlorine. The hydrogen bonds here, we'll see in a second, are due to the polar nature of a water molecule. Here's a view of a polar covalent, a covalent, and an ionic bond. Here you can see that it's really a gradient, in this case, based on the difference in electronegativity between the atoms that are involved in the relationship. In this case, chlorine, hydrogen and chlorine, or sodium and chlorine that we saw earlier. So the question is, why liquid water? Well, water's property is greater than the sum of its parts. It's polar, can exist as solid, liquid, and gas here on Earth. It has cohesion, which leads to the properties of transpiration. Ice is less dense than liquid, means that ice floats on top, gives a protective thermal layer on ice, say for ice ages. It's a universal solvent, has high specific heat, allows for evaporative cooling. So if you're sweating, that's how we're able to cool down. It's got a neutral pH. Here's what we can see with polarity in the poles on the Earth. Hydrogen bond here gives you some of the bond distances. So the polarity works kind of like this. You have two hydrogen atoms, each with one electron. You have one oxygen atom, complete with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, but 6 valence electrons, so 6 on the outside. Now it is 2 electrons away from being more noble and stable. So if you look back to periodic table, oxygen here is 2 away from being like neon. Hydrogens will come in, instead of bonding like this, where there's kind of like an equal distance between the hydrogen and the oxygen, it turns out that in fact, oxygen being more electronegative or having a higher effective nuclear charge pulls on those electrons more, so those electrons reside closer to oxygen. What this does, it creates a dipole moment and gives an area of increased negativity towards the oxygen, an area of increased positive charge near the hydrogens. Here's a quick look at the pH scale. Again, water, pure water being a 7. We'll talk about this more as the year goes on, in particular with ocean acidification. The book talks about the buildup from atoms to molecules to biomolecules. Here you can see the 4 main groups would be carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Nucleic acids making up RNA and DNA, made up of subunit nucleotides. So these guys up here are all polymers, so many units, and they're built up of monomers. So proteins composed of a combination of 20 amino acids, lipids, which include triglycerides, made up of fatty acids, broken down even further to glycerol. These function in energy storage for long term. And then you can see carbohydrates, polysaccharides for many sugar level, di for 2, mono for 1. Notice those structures in there. This would be like a glucose. This would be like a sucrose. In this case, the polysaccharide looks like a chain of cellulose, or perhaps, well, it's cellulose, but it could perhaps be glycogen as they're linking together. So linking together multiple hexagon structures. All right, that about wraps it up for this. You can take a look real quick at some of these review questions. Gives you the answers afterwards. Keep in mind this is on OneDrive, so the just PowerPoint straight from the book is available for you on OneDrive. Don't forget, in the comments, you need to leave some kind of thoughtful link connection. It can be a website, it can be a news story, it can be a podcast link, but something interesting and cool. You can also leave regular questions like, hey, I did not understand this. Part 2 will have us dealing with BioGeoChemical Cycles as we continue Unit 1 in the living world. Thanks a lot, guys.